My name is Swati. I am the co-founder of Janaagraha, and I have a background in architecture, design and planning. And I have done my master's from Pratt Institute in New York, USA.
My name is Ramesh. I am one of the co-founders of Janaagraha. I have a background in banking and finance. I worked in the US for 10 years in banking before my wife and I returned to Bangalore to start Janaagraha.
The idea of Janaagraha was conceived in the year 2001. It came out of having worked with the government. Ramesh was part of a task force which was set up by the Chief Minister of Karnataka, Mr. S. Krishna, which was looking at revamping the entire municipal financial accounting system. And part of the goal for us was that this would then enable citizen participation in budgeting, in the budgeting exercise for the municipality. What happened though was that there was a pushback from the government which said that, well, we are not sure, while we are happy to do the financial cleanup, we really don't want citizens to participate. And that's when the penny kind of dropped for us, and we realized that essentially if we have to create a citizen platform, it cannot be hooked, not have any kind of umbilical cord which is connected to government. It had to be independent, it had to be purely for citizens, and that was the genesis of Janaagraha.
When we returned to India in 1998, we came back with the desire to deepen the idea of democracy. Our life in the US had given us lots of experiences where we actually saw democracy in action at the grassroots. We saw hundreds of people living in their local towns, getting involved in local issues voluntarily. And for Swati and me, that was a revelation to say, this is not the kind of democracy that we had in our mind when we left India, which is you have politicians and bureaucrats, and then you have average citizens who pretty much don't do anything except maybe complain about things or read about things in the newspaper. What we could call in the alphabet of democracy, it's like a spectator sport. All we're doing is watching other people act in this. So when we came back, it was with this inspiration of energizing the idea of democracy, of deepening democracy from representation to participation. And that was really the idea behind Janaagraha. When we began Janaagraha, it was with the thought that it would be a movement, it would run one campaign, and once that got catalyzed, we could then go back to our lives as we had before. But that wasn't to be. What began as a movement then continued and then became an institution, and now is a significant part of what we do with our lives.
The first campaign of Janaagraha was on participatory budgeting. We were inspired hugely by a similar initiative which took place in Porto Alegre in South America, and where you had about 50,000 people who got together in a stadium and presented what they call the people's budget to their local governments. We thought that this was almost like a silver bullet to say, bring transparency, accountability, participation, and you will have magic happen, you'll have democracy working. And that was our first campaign. It was called the Ward Works campaign. We took one portion of the municipal budget, which was to do with local neighborhood spending, which was allocated to each of the council members of the municipality. And this is where we said citizens should participate and get their voices heard into this. So the campaign was a call to action for all citizens. We ran it like a private sector sort of launching a product, an FMCG product, where we put out a call to say, here are some fools who think that we can change our city if we just give 2 hours. And if dreams are made by fools, then we urge you to call us. We were run off our feet. We had thousands of people calling us and saying, I'm a fool, what do you want us to do? So it was an extraordinary revelation that it burst the myth of the apathetic urban middle class, and we had thousands participating into defining what were their needs in their local areas, whether it was broken roads, footpaths, drains, streetlights, parks, etc., identifying expenditures that they wanted and presenting it to their governments. At the end of the campaign was a presentation of the people's budget from the wards that participated.
And just to put some numbers to that, we had out of that time, Bangalore had 100 wards. This was in 2001, and we had participation from about 65 wards in the campaign. But in many of the wards, the number of people who participated were only 3 or 4 people, and there wasn't what you could call critical mass. The critical mass, which had at least 30% of the residents of a ward being represented by people in the neighborhoods, was in about 33 wards, which was about one third of the city. They collectively identified works adding up to approximately 150 crores worth of rupees. which is about 1.5 billion rupees. The budget that we were focusing on, which was called the ward works budget, was approximately 50 crore rupees for the entire city. Each ward would get an allocation of about 50 lakhs of rupees, which is 5 million rupees. So the entire city of 100 wards had 50 crores or 500 million rupees. This was the issue, this was the item that we wanted people's participation in. But even in 1/3 of them, the identified works were 1.5 billion rupees. So they had to negotiate among themselves, they had to negotiate between middle class and poor, with their local councillors and so on. And when the campaign ended, and it ended with the release of the budget of the city, in 22 out of these 33 wards, a total of 10.7 crores or 107 million rupees of works had been identified and included in the ward works budget, which represented about 22% of the total works that were identified for that year. So in that sense, it was a significant success. In some sense, you could say the first systematic way of getting people's involvement in a tangible exercise like a city budget in urban India.
Some of the significant landmarks in our journey has been, one, the first realization to say that this is not a movement, that in order for this to sustain, it had to be institutionalized, which means you needed an organization around what we were doing. And that was a critical first step to say, oh my God, we thought that we were just in it to create the energy for participation, to create the energy for, transparency and accountability of government, and then that's it, we could ride off into the sunset and do our own thing. So I think that was a big landmark to say that this required a deep and long-lasting commitment which could only be filled through an organization. So that was the first big one.
Along the way, we've also expanded the scope of activities. Initially, we thought that we could only focus on one aspect, which is citizen participation. But as we understood more about the challenges facing cities, we also realized that while participation was an important ingredient of change, it was not the only ingredient of change. There were several aspects. For instance, one of the areas that Swati was working on was on the issue of planning. How can we get better plans for our cities so that then you get better outcomes? And that's a whole other initiative that needed to be taken up. Today we have 9 such initiatives across Janaagraha and a sister organization called India Urban Space, each addressing a different aspect of urban quality of life. And these programs work both with citizens and with the government. Some key milestones that we've achieved over these last 10 years. One of the most significant milestones was in 2004-05, when the government of India announced the largest national initiative for urban reforms in India, called the Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission. It was the largest federal initiative of its kind, which affected all of urban India. And it was a mission that came in with a substantial amount of money, about $100 billion. 50% of that came from the government of India's own kitty. But the money came with reform conditions. There were 14 conditions that state and city governments had to change, had to accept in order to accept the money from the government of India. 2 of those 14 reform conditions were drafted by Janaagraha, so they were a significant advocacy success for us. One was a mandatory law for community participation, so that the experiences that we had had in our first campaign could become institutionalized in municipal statutes. And the second of those reforms was a law for public disclosure, which is mandatorily requiring local governments to actually put out in a quarterly fashion their financial statements, their statements of performance and service level benchmarks and so on. So this was one example of a significant success and a milestone in Janaagraha's journey in 2004-05. But we've had several since then as well.
We've also had a call from a state, a significant state in northern India, which is called the state of Rajasthan. And there we actually worked with the government again. This was all our work with government. While we started with working with citizens, this is the expansion of going into reforms, working with government, with all 3 levels of a federal structure. The union government, which was the JNNUR and that Ramesh just described. But we also work with a state to create significant state level reforms and state level projects. And third level was most recently with local governments now, where we're actually looking at doing and changing the quality of life by actually looking at roads. So we have a project called Tender Sure, which is changing the specifications for urban roads execution, which is all about actual implementation with far greater urban design standards and procurement standards and contractual standards for those that are executing the work. So these are the ways by which we've actually worked with government on the working with citizens, one of the big landmarks was our entire exposure into the social media and into the online networking space. So using the power of social networks to create social change, we've created two platforms. One at a national level, which works against corruption, which is called iPayToBribe.com, which we launched on our Independence Day, August 15th, 2010. And the next one that we will be launching next month, which is called iChangeMyCity.com, which is all about hyperlocal citizen participation at the neighborhood level.
We've had a couple of other key successes and milestones as well. We've had many failures, by the way, along these 10 years. One of these significant milestones was work on improving the quality of urban voter rolls. We've been working for the last 6 years on this, and about 2 years ago we worked with the Election Commission of India, which is the constitutional authority in the country that actually is responsible for the conduct of elections and the maintenance of voter lists. What we showed to the Election Commission was that the quality of the voter lists in our cities was quite poor because of systemic issues like migration into cities and migration even within cities. Over a period of several years of advocacy, the Election Commission finally acknowledged this, and we currently have a very critical program that is running to fundamentally transform how voter lists are managed, and we're showcasing this in one constituency where we've already got many successes of improving the list, and now we're at a stage where we're going to systematize this and make it into a manual which the Election Commission can use across urban India.
Well, first of all, we had to learn. So I think that was the biggest challenge, because we didn't come with a pedagogy or a professional background of having worked in the social space. We were both creatures of the private sector. So this was a journey for us personally into how nations are built, how societies work, how social reform takes place, how policy reforms take place, and how democracy comes alive. So I think the first challenge was just educating ourselves. The second challenge was actually resources. Getting the right kind of talent and the right kind of commitment with both the heart and the head to work on this and to stay committed, to continue working on this was a big challenge, and actually continues to be a big challenge, although I think we've stabilized now to a fair extent, so I'm very hopeful that we're on stable ground now.
Swati referred to an important set of challenges which very often non-profits don't talk about, which is the challenges within the organization. Most often when you talk about non-profits, because our visions for change are so large and the issues that we work on are so significant and visible, that we only tend to talk about those as our challenges, which is how do you actually bring about the change on the urban landscape? How do you actually transform quality of life in our cities? And there are a number of challenges on those fronts. Those are what you could call the external challenges. And there the challenges are, because we live in a democracy, because we believe in the power of a democracy, the ability to create that change is a function of the ability of us to persuade people. It's the power of the argument that we have. And so the challenge here is, in a political economy with so many different players, with so many stakeholders within government, in the political system, in the bureaucracy, outside government, media, opinion leaders, how do you catalyze change where a critical mass of people begin to say the same things? But the challenges that are inside the organization, which Swati referred to, actually are the first set of challenges, because if you don't get this right, we cannot be a sustainable organization which can then do justice to the agenda we've set for ourselves.
A visionary leader, extraordinary integrity, and a great deal of passion and commitment. The power to convince, the power to cut across all segments of society and connect with them at their own level and do it comfortably and with the honesty and integrity.
A remarkable leader, a terrific professional, someone who I believe I'm a stickler for details. Swati takes it completely to the next level. A believer in innovation. All of our new technology initiatives, all of our ideas about social media have all come from her. Again, someone who cares a lot about her colleagues, who can bring a sense of personal touch, a sense of empathy to the workplace, so that people feel comfortable in working and coming to Janaagraha. The 2-minute story on what Janaagraha does will go as follows. Janaagraha works on transforming quality of life in our cities and towns. We define quality of life as having two components. The first is the quality of infrastructure and services. the roads, the traffic, the water, the garbage, essentially the things that people can experience in their day-to-day lives in our cities. But we also define quality of life as the quality of citizenship, which is the degree to which we as residents of our cities feel a sense of ownership over our cities and actually engage and participate in improving our cities. To Janaagraha, both these aspects of quality of life, which is both the physical aspects of quality of life, but also the level to which we take ownership, are both equally important. And so we define quality of life as both these. In order to transform quality of life, we work both with citizens as well as with the government, because we believe that if you work only with citizens, what you get is a lot of very rich grassroots experiences, but they don't translate into large, scalable, sustainable change. And the reverse is also true. If you work only with the government, the danger is that you can become a think tank which is removed from the grassroots realities of what people experience on a day-to-day basis. So we need to bring both those dimensions together. We have a total of 9 programs that we run. 7 of them are run directly in Janaagraha. 2 of them are run in a sister organization that Swati chairs called India Urban Space, and those focus exclusively on urban planning and urban design issues. These 7 programs address different aspects of urban challenges, whether it is on roads or whether it's on urban planning, whether it's on the urban voter list or whether it's on using technology to address corruption, and finally whether it's on today's citizens or whether it's on the youth, which is the youngsters who are the next generation of urban residents, which is the students in our schools. So we have a portfolio of programs that cut across these various aspects of urban life, put together in 9 activities.
Well, all of the programs that we run, which we believe are transformative programs, both on the government policy and institutional front, as well as on the front of getting citizens to engage and participate. I think if we achieve the kinds of metrics and the targets that we have, we would call ourselves as having succeeded to a large extent, and then take on more and more programs, more and more challenges. But the kinds of large picture challenges that we have taken on, I think will require a significant amount of time, energy and investment of human resources to achieve.
In tangible terms, what that would mean is we have, out of these 9 programs that we run, we have several which are on the ground, in the grassroots. Success there would be improving in a very tangible way, making a difference in that particular neighborhood. So if we want to fix the quality of voter lists in one assembly constituency, in one part of Bangalore, then ensuring that error rates are very low, accuracy of the voter list is close to 100%, so that people can actually feel enfranchised when there is an election. Turnouts should be at least 20% more than what they were in the average over the past 5-10 elections. So that's a very tangible example of what would change. Because if that happened, people are more engaged, elected representatives are more accountable. Similarly, when we work with students in their schools, we measure their knowledge of civic awareness and civic engagement. And we want to create a significant improvement in students who go through these programs that we run, so that they become explicitly more informed and engaged as citizens and residents of urban India. And on the policy front, of course, we want to create better laws and better policies which can result in downstream benefits for urban quality of life.
Well, at both we need to achieve 2 things. One is at the level of the organization itself, that we have to build a robust organization that can then become one of the most admired not-for-profit institutions, not just in the country but in the world. And for this we need to put the appropriate systems in place, we need to bring in the appropriate talent, nurture the talent, increase the pool, create an energy with volunteers, create the appropriate metrics and targets for ourselves which are very clear, which everybody understands and delivers on. So I think that's at the institutional level, have a board which is engaged with us, have all of the checks and balances that make a great organization, an institution. So I think that's as far as the internal is concerned. On the external front, we're very clear that we want to actually help and support. And part of what is unique about Janaagraha is that we are not about ideological entrenched positions. We are about practical problem solving, and this means looking at issues and challenges of governance, of quality of life, and addressing them together with government, bringing citizens and government together and bringing them closer. There's no us and them anymore, there's only us. And so part of one of the big achievements that we want going forward is to continue this journey of building credibility for Janaagraha and its activities with government, so that there is a mutual trust and respect for what each brings to the table, and then we work in partnership. We also want to energize the ecosystem, which is not just the individual citizen, but the business community, the various kinds of communities that can actually work together and all come together in partnerships in looking at issues not in silos but in an integrated manner where you each bring your strengths to play to create a larger good.
Any country that's a democracy will see change happen through the intersection of a variety of forces, and these forces can broadly be falling into three buckets. You have the state itself, which is the various instruments of government. You have the market, which is again made up of businesses, business industry groups, media and so on. But then you have civil society, which is made up of communities, community organizations and civil society institutions and non-profits. The intersection of these forces and the voices that they would then bring to the table for change is what creates a vibrant democracy. And so in this ecosystem, the voice of credible, professionally run non-profits is a critical voice to carry a democratic process forward, and that's really what Janaagraha looks to do within the space of urban change that we are focused on.
I also want to say that Janaagraha is actually a coined phrase, and I just wanted to give you a bit of a background on what Janaagraha itself means. It takes its inspiration from Mahatma Gandhi's movement of non-violence towards freedom, which is called Satyagraha. And Satyagraha itself is a coined phrase. Satya, which means truth, and Agraha, which is the moral force. So Satyagraha, the moral force of truth. Janaagraha is Jana, which is people, and Agraha, so it is the power of the people. And that is the genesis of Janaagraha.
It's the challenges of a non-profit organization are twofold. One is the external challenges of the issues that we care about, but equally important is the internal challenges of building a robust institution. And those challenges essentially involve around accessing the right kind of people, bringing on board the right kind of talent, and ensuring that there are good performance systems so that people who are coming on board are held accountable for very clearly defined and accepted metrics of delivery. This means that as we go to execute on our vision and start implementing programs, we will have to react to the realities of the world around us, because change doesn't happen in our own hands. The change that we want to see is happening outside through various other forces. As we react, we have to have the ability to adapt our programs and recalibrate what we want to do. And the way we do that is by having talented people who are working within a rigorous performance-oriented culture.
We actually took the middle path with government, where it was between toothless collaboration to mindless confrontation. And I think we went into saying that we want to do partnerships which are not based out of ideology, they are partnerships based out of problem solving. And I think it's built over time. Two things that government looks for. One is this all about just painting them black with no solutions, or just saying that here's why these people are all bad and this is what they are inefficient and corrupt and ineffective about? Or is this about problem solving? And are you actually willing to get into the trenches with us to help us solve the problem without creating a huge negative buzz and making us look bad? And I think it's over time that we have built this credibility at all three levels of government, wherever we've worked. Where we worked quietly, we worked with the system, we have worked to look at innovations and look at ways by which we actually implement and help government to draft, to craft, to run various schemes and suggestions that we give, that we provide. And I think that has built our credibility to a very large extent, where there's a mutual trust now. There is a certain element of trust that says that, okay, they're not just about making us look bad. Certainly it doesn't remove our voice to be able to criticize when we see things are wrong. But at the same time, they're not about saying, let's show them up for all the wrong things that they're doing. We're about solving the issues and the challenges of urban India.
We feel that and it goes to the heart of a belief that people care. A lot of the time when we began Janaagraha, people told us that the urban citizen is apathetic, the urban citizen doesn't care, they have enough other things to worry about. And we approached, right from the very beginning, from our very first campaign, we approached the work that we do with citizens with fresh eyes, with a sense of optimism and hope that people do care. Everybody cares, whether you're a poor person or a middle class person or a rich person, you do care. What you don't have is the ability to translate that caring into some action. And what therefore we need to do is to be innovative about it. This is about civic innovation. How can we make it possible for people to connect? That means the issue that we bring to the table, the way in which we present that issue, the opportunities we give for people to be able to participate in these have to be innovative, recognizing that people have constraints of their jobs, of their families, of their work lives and so on. So that's been the distinguishing factor to our approach of working with citizens.
This is a new medium, and we believe that the power for this medium to enable us to reach across the country is humongous. This was something that we were grappling with until 5 years ago, when we ran our very first campaign, which was online, which was called the Jagure Tata Tea. Jagure literally means wake up. It essentially means, and then we moved on to Jagte Raho, which is eternal vigilance, and it was our voter campaign, where we exhorted the youth of the country to register online to become voters. And that campaign was an eye-opener. At the end of the campaign, we had a historic 500,000 young people registered for the first time. This was unprecedented, and another 1 million who weren't able to get registered because there was a fulfillment mechanism that was just unable to cope. But this actually really showcased the power of the network, the internet, and the power of social networks in actually spreading the word around and getting people to connect. So our second campaign was I Paid a Bribe, and this was about corruption. It was about retail corruption. It was not about the big scale, what we call wholesale corruption, but it was about the small corruptions, what you and I in India normally what we are confronted with, what we call petty bribing. And so that's retail corruption, getting your death certificate, your birth certificate, getting your vehicle registered, traffic police, all of these, registering of land, property transaction. These are ones where ordinary citizens confront corruption daily, and this is what we were looking to record. And this is the first crowdsourcing of this kind of reports of corruption anywhere in the world. And we started with the modest targets, but we found that within 22 months we've actually crossed 1 million visitors, and we've had over 20,000 reports, instances of bribe taking. And so clearly this is a medium which is extraordinary, and we look to leverage it in many innovative ways, and we are looking constantly to see how else we can take this. We have another new one which is launching, which is called I Change My City, which is launching next month, which looks at doing 3 things to empower citizens so that they can act to change their neighborhoods, because we do believe that real change ultimately begins with you in your neighborhoods. It's all about hyper-local civic action. And so the site does 3 things for you on that, which is it allows you an ability to complain about your issues, your local civic issues. It allows you to connect and form networks, which you start online, but you can connect on the ground as well, of issue-based but also neighborhood-based networks. And the third thing it does is actually gives you a lot of information which is unprecedented in a spatial manner, using maps, making it very easy about your local government, your local elected representatives, your local civic agencies, your communities, your champions, stories of success stories that others have done. So there's a lot of stuff there which actually creates a social change network.
Oh, we don't know there's anything that would distinguish us from all NGOs. There are certainly a number of NGOs that are doing outstanding work, each of which has certain characteristics I think that define those. For our own work, I think the first thing that differentiates us is that we are about urban issues, and so automatically, given the fact that India is still largely a rural country and many non-profits in India are focused on rural issues, this sets us apart. But beyond that, I think what sets us apart are the fact that we are not ideological about our work, we are pragmatic. We take the middle path to working with the government. We don't go into confrontation or toothless collaboration. We are problem solvers. We are willing to put our feet on the ground and get our hands dirty with solving problems. We also step back and think about scale issues, which means we are in a constant process of doing, thinking, learning and doing, so that we never lose sight of the forest for the trees, even as we are getting into the details of issues. Finally, it's about the talent that we're putting together. We're constantly looking to bring extraordinarily talented people who care and can align with our vision and values for change, because we know that we can only be a catalyst for change, and the true energy for change must come ultimately from how this goes out and gets amplified in the cities that we work in.
I don't know if I would call it a modern corporation, but I certainly think that one of the things that we are taking from the private sector is the ability to measure, the willingness, and then creating structures and frameworks by which we hold ourselves accountable. I think especially because Janaagraha's work is all about asking governments to be accountable, I think it behoves upon us as an institution to make sure that we ourselves are also accountable. What is it that we are committing to? How are we measuring how well we are doing in the work that we are doing? And then how are we setting targets and achieving those targets and reporting those targets? So I think there we are certainly learning a lot of lessons from the private sector, and you could say therefore we are saying that it's certainly a non-negotiable. So it is a key but insufficient condition to have the passion and the heart for social change, but you also need to perform like the private sector. So to that extent, yes, it is like a corporation.
To add to that, so what we have is a system called a balanced scorecard. We have a performance management system which many private sector corporations use, which is essentially a way of pulling together different aspects of performance management, which goes right from the vision and values of the organization. What is it that stakeholders can get out of it? How does it fit into how you allocate financial resources? And finally, how do you master the talent and the resources that are necessary to actually deliver on this? All of this comes together for us in a framework called the Balanced Scorecard, which has been developed by professors at MIT, at Harvard, Professor Robert Kaplan and his team. And we use that. And this is a relatively few number of non-profits which have actually embarked on this. The second aspect is that we're extremely rigorous about financial disclosure and accountability. We have a very tough and clean system of how we manage our accounts, how we disclose our accounts, and we do this in a systematic way. We produce quarterly statements which go out to all our donors, and there again, it's a reflection of how, what one might say, a well-run, well-governed private sector company would be run, and so we try to take some lessons on performance management, governance, transparency, and so on from the private sector.
I think that while we are very clear about the areas of work that we want to do, and that has been defined because we are also constantly wary of having mission creep, we know that there is a certain boundary of work. We're very nimble and we're very creative, and we understand that change doesn't happen, in a single instance, that it is incremental. So there are many avenues and ways towards that path of change. So therefore we set our sights on where we want to go, and the means of going there could be, meandering, could be focused somewhere, slight deviation to go to that path, but we're constantly very aware that that's where we want to go and make sure that that's where we go.
And to build on that, we've captured this process through something called a theory of change methodology. This is again something that is used by non-profits. It's an increasingly interesting tool which we have found very useful and valuable for Janaagraha. What the theory of change essentially says is, what is the change that you want to see? And from that change, you take your step back in terms of cause-effect loops, which means if you want to see this change, what are the factors that would drive that change? What are the causal linkages that would then enable that change to get catalyzed? And so you have a framework which is essentially laying out the hypotheses of how you expect to see that change happen. And that becomes the navigational device to then run your organization and to undertake your activities. Where that fits into innovation is that you're then able to say, this is what we thought needs to happen, because this is how we thought the cause-effect loops would take place, but they didn't in reality. And therefore, while 7 of them might have worked, 3 of them didn't, you need to recalibrate on those 3, change the theory of change so that you can then go back and rework how these loops would take place. This is a constant process of thinking, learning, analyzing and readapting. And it can't be codified, because that then somehow makes it look like it's somewhat of a dry and boring academic exercise. But it's much more about being close to the ground and staying focused on the change that we wish to see happen.
I think one additional point to that is that one of the big things that has helped Janaagraha is the portfolio effect. The fact that we don't put all our eggs in the one basket, but that we have a portfolio of projects and programs that we run, I think has a big lever for us, because if there is a dry spell for one program, it really doesn't matter because the 6 other are chugging. And so if there is, it's at different various places, there's a lull and then there's a peak. And that's okay, because there's constantly so much work that's going on that we're always moving forward. And I think that's one of the big reasons for us continuously being able to innovate. If it's not in one, then it's in another, or it's in fifth or sixth.
This is an extremely important point that Swati's made, and that actually there's a second benefit. There's the first benefit, which is the fact that you do have the ability for one to be able to pick up, and while the other might have been going through a rough space. But there's also that they tend to feed on each other. So the benefit of one can actually help catalyze change in another at a much faster rate than if it was taken up on its own basis. One example of this is in our initiative called iPayThePrice.com. We managed to get the government to actually undertake some reforms that come out of the analysis of iPayThePrice.com. If the iPayThePrice.com initiative had been done on a standalone basis, without the benefit of all the other programs, it would not have succeeded as much, because the benefit of the reputational equity that we have with the government, the successes that we have by doing so many other programs with the government, has allowed I Pay the Price's advocacy work to also become far more effective.
We have a number of values. Positivity is a big one, constructive engagement, power of community, professionalism,
moral compass, empathy, democratic decision making, data driven, and action. There are many technical definitions of corruption, but for Janaagraha's purposes, because we are an activist and action oriented organization, we are essentially looking at two broad forms of corruption. What we call wholesale corruption, which are issues of corruption and bribery that happen at a national level. There have been many examples of this corruption in India over the last year. Commonwealth Games saw a lot of issues of corruption. The allocation of licenses for telecom players was another example of it. We call these wholesale corruption. These are big ticket corruption examples, and in our opinion, this happens in every country around the world. There's a second category of corruption which Janaagraha cares about, which is what is called retail corruption. This is the stuff that bothers average people in our day-to-day lives, having to get a driver's license or a birth certificate or registering a parcel of land. And that's the second category of corruption, is what we care about.
I think that it's because of, it depends on which corruption we're talking about. So let me stay with the retail corruption. Retail corruption is widespread because of a number of reasons, and there are historical reasons for this, but ultimately it's about the fact that there is very little accountability, and Professor Klickard has this great equation where he says C equals a monopoly, which is corruption, equals a monopoly with complete discretion minus accountability. So it's C equals M plus, sorry, I forgot that. What did I say? Discretion, M plus D. So C equals M plus D minus A. So this is essentially it. You have a lot of government services which are a monopoly, and they are in the public domain, and there's very little there's complete discretion from the public sector in how they actually run these services for government, for citizens, and there's very little accountability, which means there's very little penal clauses. So there's a high reward and very low risk of being found out, the high financial reward and very low risk of being found out. The second big reason is because our government services tend to pay far less than global trends and developed countries do for their human resources, and so our salaries are very, very low, and very often government servants come in paying, already having paid a bribe to get that position, and it's coveted because it's long term, nobody can take you out of that position. So I think that again I will focus on the retail corruption part of it. The challenge is essentially that in fact iPayThePrice.com is looking to solve is first of all data. Nobody even knows the size, the scale, the geography, the institutional nature of this kind of corruption. So we all exchange anecdotal information, but really we don't have the numbers. We don't know where the gaps are. We don't know which department has higher, which particular city is greater. You know, what is it? What are the breeding grounds of corruption? I think that is the biggest challenge on addressing corruption. Once we know that, once we know that these are the things, once we acknowledge them, then we look at the institutional nature. And by the way, one of the big things that we say in Janaagraha and as part of the site that we run, I Pay to Bribe, we say this is really not about individuals, corrupt acts by individuals. It's actually institutional structures that enable this kind of corruption, and that's what we look to seek to tackle. So I think that once you actually get the data on how corruption plays out, it becomes easy to then look at the processes, institutional processes, which allow graft of this nature, and then plug those rules, plug those gaps, either by shortening those processes, re-engineering those processes, using technology to enable those processes and remove the human intervention element of it. So these are some of the ways by which we look at the challenges and then some of the solutions of retail corruption.
Well, there could certainly be some truth in that, but we think that culture itself is a function of rules of the game. And there's no better example than Georgia, which used to be a Soviet Union country, which in a matter of 10 years has gone from being one of the most corrupt countries in the world on the Transparency International Index to one of the least corrupt countries in the world. And you can't explain that kind of a dramatic switch in the perception and the behavior around bribery and corruption in a society by talking about culture, because clearly there is something deeper than that that's at play. Our hypothesis is that if you can change the rules of the game, if you can make the processes of government services less monopolistic, less discretionary and more accountable, people will then play by those new rules of the game, and once you get a critical mass of people who get used to the new rules of the game, you will have a less of a tolerance of corruption in society at large. And that's the transition that India is making right now.
Well, this was actually, this was conceived with a member of our board, Sridhar Iyengar. When we were in a discussion, Ramesh and Sridhar and I were talking about how terrible it is. Corruption is always, one of the big topmost issues that we Indians feel depressed about, and yet we're not able to do anything other than, the occasional sort of unrealistic thing of saying, hang that person, on the street corner and make an example of this person or that person. So we said, wouldn't it be great if we actually knew, first of all, what is the scale and size of this? And wouldn't it be great if we had a site, if there was a site where you could say, I paid a bribe of this amount. And we start gathering this data. And that's when we said, wow, actually this has legs. We could potentially think of crowdsourcing this information through an online platform, ipaytobribe.com. And that was the genesis of ipaytobribe.com. We launched it on August 15, 2010, which was just under 2 years ago. And we have a million hits.
And the heart of this idea was also this belief that you don't have to moralize to people not to pay a bribe. Let's acknowledge the fact that there are certain institutional gaps, there are constraints that people are finding themselves in, which are forcing them to have to pay a bribe. And if you make that as the starting point, the site then offers in some sense a way of coming and being a confessional for people to say, I paid a bribe and I can't stand the fact that I had to pay this bribe, but I was in that difficult position. So we're taking away a value judgment about the fact that people have had to pay a bribe. What we care about is the fact that we're now getting important data about where the heat map of corruption, so to speak, so that you can then go about and talk about the interventions that are needed.
Well, the first one was that this is a new space. It's an evolving field which has many moving parts, not something that we understand, social media, the whole phenomenon of social media. And then as we begin to understand it, the ground changes under our feet. So it's actually constantly learning, staying with it, understanding what are the various networks, what are the various technologies that go with enabling such a network. And so I think part of the biggest challenges that we had was to say understanding this animal called internet social media networks. So I think that's been our biggest challenge, and it's besides that, it's really, I would say singularly, I would put that as the very large challenge. The strength is that it actually is a very, very straightforward value proposition. It allows citizens to come onto the site and do three things. It allows me to report when I paid a bribe. It allows me to report if I haven't paid a bribe, I've resisted paying a bribe, and I need to share that story as well. And it allows me also to report when I meet an honest officer, somebody who did my work without any expectation, without any demand of bribes or graft. These are the three big action items, but beyond this, it actually provides for the first time a network where I can come in. If I'm going into a transaction with government, I start looking to see what are the experiences of others, and I start learning. And it started with this very tongue-in-cheek sort of a value proposition to say, if I do have to pay a bribe, let me at least find out what is the going rate of corruption for that particular transaction with government. Am I paying on target, or am I getting fleeced? Am I paying more than I should be paying for this bribe, or less? And so it allows you to actually look and uncover the price of corruption. So when you go in, you can actually click and say, for this transaction in this city, what's the going rate? And it will tell you what the lowest people have paid and what the highest people have paid. And so you can kind of go armed with that information and do what you have to do with it. So
we've written off a fair amount in Janaagraha already. Our vision itself is quite large. It's to transform quality of life in urban India. Our specific programs, 7 of them in Janaagraha and 2 of them in a sister organization called India Urban Space, which Swati runs, also have very large agendas in each of these programs. So we have our work cut out for us over the short and medium term. And as we go along this, because we are an organization that responds to the signals that we are getting in our work, we'll certainly be innovating both in how we execute these programs, but also in coming up with possibly new ancillary ideas that strengthen these programs and strengthen the vision of improving quality of life. There could be several kinds of questions. One is, and let me just list 3 or 4 that come to me at the top of my head. Is it important to solve urban problems in a country like India, which has got 65% of its people living in villages? 2, what does it take to build a credible, not-for-profit organization in the social space? And there could be a number of questions or issues that come up around that. Is it just money? Is it talent? Is it vision? Is it the strategy that you adopt in terms of the levers that you want to use to drive the change? So in that sense, it fits into the equivalent of a private sector company. What is your business model? In this case, it is what is your theory of change? The third is, how does a not-for-profit actually have a financial model? Does it have to be having a revenue model, or can it be grant-based? And if it's grant-based, how does it find a sustainable source of revenues and funds to build credible long-term sustainability? These are 3 ideas that come to mind for me.
Let me add one more to what Ramesh has already outlined, which is, we certainly believe that the work that we do is transformational, but it's a very hard sell. The reason it's a hard sell is because it's actually a horizontal segment. It's not a vertical. It's not a very clear vertical about saying I'm working with the urban poor on housing or jobs or something like that. I'm not working with the environment. I'm not working with children on midday meal program, etc. We are actually looking to bring systemic change, which actually cuts horizontally. We're looking to change institutional structures, policies, governance systems, participation, all of that which actually has a horizontal aspect to it. And part of our challenge is to actually make that visible, to say that this is equally important, and in fact it doesn't have to be so sectoral in nature that people must continue to engage and invest and promote sectoral initiatives, that there is a very large case to be made for this kind of a horizontal nature of work as well.
Well, starting initiatives and undertaking social change is a function of the people who are beginning this, and the vision that they have and the capacity that they have to take this on and move ahead with it. And it doesn't matter whether it's a large vision or whether it's a small initiative. It's ultimately about doing justice to that idea that has come up in your own head. For both of us, this was something that we wanted to do. We were young enough, we were at a particular point in our lives where we felt we could do justice to this, and we had several years that we could look forward to say, let's build this correctly, because our ambition is large and therefore the foundational work also needed to be significant. It's taken us 10 years now and counting to get to this stage in Janaagraha, and therefore we've had the luxury of having that runway room and building that to then carry this forward. But for somebody who looks at this and takes some kind of inspiration from what we do, they can take any aspect of the programs that we run and say, I'd like to repeat only this, or take up a piece of this and do this again. But I think it would be somewhat immodest of us to suggest that we have some wisdom that we can give to anybody else. Ultimately, this is about entrepreneurship, and you don't have to train entrepreneurship. People who are entrepreneurs know how to take this forward and find the resources to address their visions.
Yeah, I would like to add that We started Janaagraha 10 years ago, and our whole journey of public change like this, it started a few years before that, but Janaagraha itself and our own organization doing the work that we do, we began with two things. We began with idealism, and we began with a healthy dose of naivety. And I think these two were all we began with. And today we have built an organization which have a lot of people who are energized and passionate about the work that the organization is doing. But I think you can't predict it. You have to start small. Start wherever you're comfortable with, and then your journey will define itself. So I think if you plan too far ahead and if you plan too much ahead, that's also a little bit of a detriment. So let it come to you. Just begin however you feel most comfortable with. That's what I would say.